All right, so hi everyone, and welcome to this really important and topical panel. My name is Jewry, and I'm one of the grassroots organisers. This event was set up because a number of us are really passionate about ensuring that our friends, our family, our colleagues, our connections are provided an update on the current events in Israel with the Israel-Hamas war, and also kept across the close to 500% increase in anti-Semitic incidents across Australia over the last 6 weeks. We are so very grateful to our panelists and our moderator for giving up their time this evening. So thank you so much, guys. And I'd like to introduce our moderator who will expertly guide our panels. So David Shafer. David is an Executive Director, Chief Operating Officer and Chief Financial Officer of ASX-listed Kogan.com, which is a portfolio of retail and services businesses in Australia and New Zealand. David was previously a lawyer at ABL. And so without any further ado, over to you, and thank you so much, Dave.
Thank you, Irid, for that kind introduction. Just a reminder to everyone listening that the purpose of this public event is to unpack the Israel-Hamas crisis from 3 perspectives. The first perspective is what's going on in Israel. How are Israelis thinking about the massacre? What's the end game? What's the public mood right now? And what's likely to happen next? The second perspective is how is the Jewish community in Australia thinking about the news in and around Israel and the response to what's been happening in the streets of Australia and in civil society. And the third perspective is how are our politicians responding to what's happening in the Middle East and what's happening in our streets. So we have 3 expert panelists that cover each of those topics. The first is Nimrod Vromen. He's the CEO of a tech advisory company in Israel, while also being a partner at an Israeli law firm, Arnon Tadmor-Levy. He's been a reservist in the IDF for 20 years, having served through 4 of the 6 Gaza campaigns and the Second Lebanon War. He currently serves in the Operation Swords of Iron campaign as a Master Sergeant in the Artillery Corps, and he's logging in from Israel. The second panelist is Alex Ryvchin, co-CEO of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, which is the peak organisation for representing Jews in Australia. He's the author of the influential book, The Anti-Israel Agenda, Inside the Political War on the Jewish State. And finally, Senator James Paterson is Shadow Minister for Home Affairs and Cybersecurity. As prior chairman of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, James oversaw the listing of Hamas as a terrorist organisation in its entirety. So thank you so much to each of our panellists for joining. The format of tonight's event will be roughly 1 hour of a panel discussion moderated by me, and we'll have 20 to 30 minutes at the end for Q&A. So at any stage tonight, feel free to write a text question into the chat, and we'll go through your questions and try and answer as many as possible in that last 20 to 30 minutes. So let's kick it off. Nimrod, firstly to you, what is the national mood in Israel right now? There's recent news of a deal to retrieve 50 or more hostages in exchange for 150 Palestinian prisoners and other items. Can you take us through the sense of what's happened in Israel over the last 6 weeks, from the initial shock of 7 October up till today? Give us a sense of what's going on the front line.
All right, thank you very much, and thanks for having me. Just as a, by way of introduction, I have been working with Israeli startups for the last 15 years, with about 500 of them. Very intense practice in the consulting business and the law firm. To give you an idea of what the mood is like in Israel, that entire career of mine, I assume there are other people who've got, long careers behind them who are attending today. That entire career of mine is like a part of a different dimension. It doesn't exist to me since the 7th of October. So that sort of like sets the stage with respect to where we entered, what phase we entered in our country's existence on the 7th of October. I do want to say, before I answer in more depth, that whilst I'm in uniform, I'm providing my personal opinion based on my personal experience here. I'm not mandated by the Israeli army, and I'm happy to share my personal opinion, but I'm in uniform because I have been for the past 45 or so days since I joined. Actually, I was already let go of the IDF when I was 37. My unit is a highly technological unit, and I was personally technologically obsolete by the age of 37, even though other reservists might go to the age of 45. So when this thing happened on October 7th, my family and I were on vacation. We basically fled the hotel to a friend. As we fled the hotel, it had rockets fired at it. We had a very panicky situation with my two daughters. I've got a 9-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old daughter, and we realized live in the morning how grim the situation was. We were actually afraid. Pardon me for the background noise. We were actually afraid that we might be shot at. The notion was that there might be those vans everywhere with the terrorists looking to just execute people. We didn't know where geographically it was happening. We knew that it was happening around Gaza, but there was a fear at the time on October 7th in the morning that this was going to happen all over the country. So very frantic moments there that certainly traumatized my two girls. And then during that Saturday, it became clear just how horrible the situation was, because within a few hours, Israel is so small. Within a few hours, it became clear to us that all of us have friends by first degree of separation or second degree of separation, or family members who are directly affected by this and are affected live, are suffering because they weren't just shot immediately. They were kept in, the bomb shelters for many hours until they were killed or taken hostage. It really ate into our souls. By October 8th, I was in a state of pure depression. I was bedridden. I couldn't do anything, couldn't go to work, was basically stuck on the news. And when I say this about myself, I mean to tell the guests here that this applies to everyone in Israel. The country halted. So the people who were enlisted, they knew they had to go to the army October 7th in the morning. But everybody else was just trying to make sense of it, and we still are trying to make sense of it today. On October 9th, I decided that I might be able to build a significant and meaningful role for myself within my original unit, the UAV unit that I served in, because I do have some experience from mainly from the Second Lebanon War, which is relevant, and from Operation Cast Lead and the 2014 Gaza operation, both of which we entered Gaza. So I basically found out who my unit commander was, and I asked if I could enlist myself. So that was the day. October 9th was the day that I personally took initiative. And I think that, again, Israelis at one point during that week, each of them found a way to take some sort of initiative to do something. So that was like a change of collective mood. So as we're suffering from this depression and mourning and understanding of the gravity of the situation and trying to digest the horrors and terrors of the way that the October 7th massacre was conducted, people started taking initiative, volunteering, just in a sense, really uniting. That felt good for a bit. When I joined the unit, I immediately got into the thick of things, and I've just been there ever since. I've been taking a few nights at home with my daughters, but it's been 24/7 cycles ever since. When we regained control of Israel, there was a bit of an uplift. Again, everything is marred by the fact that we know that our lives are never going to be the same. But by the third week, the stories of the hostages became far more troubling, because you'd realize that the hostages were there for a long time. You didn't rescue them. There was no Entebbe rescue like in 1976. And now the stories of the hostages and the personal acquaintance that you slowly make with their families, who appear on the news and everywhere you look, that takes front and center while you're trying to retaliate, while you're trying to regain control and follow through on the mission to eradicate Hamas from the Gaza Strip. You're starting to feel the hostage burn. So even if we were resigned to first taking care of Hamas then negotiating for the hostages. Just the Israeli collective mindset by now, there's a lot of fatigue there. I think people are going to want to see 50 women and children released back to their homes. It's just unfathomable, especially when it comes to the children. And we know that it's not an amazing deal. I can address that later. But in terms of like the mood, you asked about the mood. I know that it's a bad deal, and I just want to see these kids not on posters anymore. I just want to see them reuniting with their families. So that's where we are now.
Over the last 6 weeks, it seems that there's been a singular objective to eradicate Hamas, and that Israel has been very reluctant to retreat from that objective. Is this deal a potential path to retreating from that objective, or is there still resolve within the Israeli establishment to actually follow through and eradicate Hamas from the Gaza Strip?
The Israeli establishment has been very clear, including in the official press briefings where they disclose the terms of the deal, that there is no stopping until Hamas is eradicated at all. That is the official instruction, and our politicians have anchored on it towards the public. They said it last night when they disclosed the terms of the deal. So if 5 days went by, which is the time of the planned ceasefire, and we weren't allowed to follow through on the mission afterwards because of decisions among governments, etc., then I think the Israeli public would penalize the government heavily for that. There are 200,000 displaced Israelis as well. I know that there are 1 million displaced Palestinians within the Gaza Strip. There are also 200,000 displaced Israelis. The Israelis are displaced by terror. They can't imagine themselves going to live on the outskirts of the Gaza Strip or the northern border. The Palestinians were asked to evacuate ahead of the IDF's mission. And I assume with the intent of letting them go back when it's over. So if we can't address that terror, we're going to have a large part of our country in a state of displacement, our economy at a halt, and I don't see how that's sustainable. So we're going to have to follow through on that objective.
So just put yourself in the mind of Hamas. Why would Hamas agree to this exchange if they genuinely believed that their time in power was limited to a number of days, weeks, or months? Surely they believe that there is a path to a permanent ceasefire. Otherwise, they wouldn't actually do this type of deal.
This is a great question. We've had many questions about Hamas's intentions and objectives. Just the way they conducted the October 7th massacre, it's almost they invited our most powerful and aggressive response. And then you have to ask yourself if they planned for that, if they planned for the response that they're actually getting. But the way I see it, the way I see it, and it's a sort of like a cheap analogy, but it works when I explain it to other people. If you watch like two chess masters play a chess game, and you've got all the pieces on the board on both sides, you'll rarely see that game end in a checkmate and like a Hollywood moment. You'll normally see, when there are still most of the pieces on the board, you'll see one player moving a piece, and you'll see the other player just backing off and saying, "Oh, I lost. I see all the eventuations. I've lost." And then they save themselves the next 5 hours of playing and, taking each other's pieces away until the game ends the way that they already know that it's going to end. This is how conventional wars are fought, including in Israel's history. In the 1967 war, when the Egyptian Air Force was taken out, the war was over on the first day. In 1973, when the Egyptian army was surrounded, the war was over. Same goes for other wars in history. Hamas knows. I think they know it just based on how much they succeeded in the first day. I didn't think they thought that they were going to succeed so much in the first day. Just based on that, they knew that already the response was going to be too strong, and they saw that Western governments were providing far more support than they normally do to Israel's campaign. So they had actually realized that they lost. But the thing is, they don't stop playing at that point. They want to draw it out as much as possible to play the entire game, because they're banking on the rules of the game changing, even within this 5-day period. To the extent that the rules of the game don't change, it's going to continue. But there are things that could change the rules of the game. The Americans have just increased their attacks in Iraq now. The Houthis in Yemen have abducted a ship that they claim to be Israeli. It's owned by a person with Israeli citizenship, but it has nothing to do with Israel, apparently. So things are heating up globally. This could stress out Western governments and other governments from this going out into an all-out global war. And then they put more pressure on Israel to stop fighting. They could use this 5-day period to showcase, more clearly, now that they have the time to move around, the damage caused to Gaza, and lobby for the people who believe that an immediate ceasefire is the right solution, to increase their pressure on their governments. So they're banking on the rules of the game changing. Israel's resolve is very strong at the moment. Still, the people here are not content with listening to any background noise at all. Maybe our government is, but our government is also cares a lot for its mandate. So if it succumbs to international pressure, it's probably going to pay the price. And in terms of like where the Israelis are as a whole, and I'm historically a center-left person, I want to follow through on this war until the very end, until the very last Hamas operative.
Okay. Thank you. Alex, to you now. So obviously, as soon as this war broke out, or even before the response from Israel, as soon as the massacre occurred on October 7, there were implications for Australia, particularly for Australian Jews and for the Australian pro-Palestinian community. We've seen protests in the streets. We've seen protests in Caulfield, in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. We've seen anti-Semitic chants. How do you believe this war in Gaza is going to impact the Australian Jewish community? And what's the correct response of the Australian political establishment to what is happening in our streets?
Well, first, David, I have to thank you and Yurit for facilitating this discussion. It's a great pleasure to be with you guys. And I want to thank my co-panelists, Nimrod, to you for your active service in defense of our state and our civilization. You have my endearing gratitude. And I hope you and all your colleagues complete your mission and return home safely. We're praying for you. And in James, we have perhaps the finest friend one can imagine in the federal parliament. And I mean that with all sincerity, not just the remarks and statements that he's consistently made in this time in our darkest hour, but this is a guy who in his maiden speech called for the embassy to be moved to Jerusalem. So truly, it means a great deal to us. Everything that you do is noted, and it means a hell of a lot to us, James, so thank you. To your question, Dave, I think we need to put it in its correct context of what transpired on October 7. And for the Jewish people, for the community here, and the Jewish people around the world, this wasn't just another spasm in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This was something of generational trauma that was inflicted on us. This is something none of us will ever forget for as long as we live. This is something that will enter our traditions and our commemorations and our liturgy. This was a tectonic event. And, in the rare quiet moments that I've had in the last 6 weeks, I keep trying to place it within the context of Jewish history to try and rationalize it and try and forecast what might be coming next. And I compare it to things like the Cossack rebellion in the 17th century in Ukraine, which brought absolute destruction to Jewish communities, and particularly the depravity and the nature of the barbarism, the rape, the torture that we saw on October 7 was similar to that. It reminds me of the Kishinev pogrom in Moldova in 1903, again in the savagery and the impact that it had on the Jewish world. And it reminds me also of when the Crusaders came through the Rhine Valley in the 11th century and destroyed entire communities in a day or two. And that's what happened here. Whole settlements and communities of Jews that had lived there for decades no longer exist effectively. So the thing that I've learned from that is that whichever comparison is most apt, every one of those examples I've given and many more transformed the course of Jewish history. They made it such that things were never the same again. They were never as they were. And I think we need to understand that we're in a different world now. We'll get used to speaking about a pre-October 7 world and a post-October 7 world. And in terms of the immediate impact on the Jewish community here, aside from that just shock and trauma and the disbelief that something like this could happen again in our time, it led to this outpouring of anti-Semitism. And the critical thing to note about that is that it didn't occur with the mounting of Israel's response. The anti-Semitism began on October 7. On October 7, you had clerics on the streets of West Sydney saying that they're happy, that they feel enthusiastic and joyous at what transpired. You saw the first protest taking place, again, with the cries for an intifada, for a free Palestine from the river to the sea, the extermination of the state of Israel. So October 7 didn't create new anti-Semites, but it revealed the depth of the hatred that exists among us. And I think it shook us from our slumber and our complacency. And any illusion or disbelief about the continuing nature of anti-Semitism, I think is gone. One thing that we're left with now as a Jewish community in this country, and I think around the world, is a greater clarity and understanding of who our friends are and who our enemies are. That's been laid bare and made clear. And in terms of what we need to do next. And the main thing we need to do is stay united. And if one positive thing has come from these horrors, it is that I've never seen the Jewish community in this country more unified. All sectarian, all left-wing, right-wing, any of those petty differences about communal organizations have just been expunged completely. We're totally unified now. I've never seen more people stepping forward saying, what can I do to help? And this is what we need, because we are now fighting a battle on every front, in the political echelon, in the media, of course, online, in the business community, in the legal community. Architects are circulating petitions against Israel, the arts and cultural space, all of these areas. So
Alex, on that, so if you go to the pro-Palestine or anti-Israel rallies, however you want to refer to them, and if you speak to some of the principals involved, they will look you in the eye and say to you, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist. I don't believe that Israel has a right to exist, or I believe that everyone has a right to be there. I love Jews. I've got lots of Jewish friends. In fact, there are some Jewish people at these rallies protesting with the same slogans of from the river to the sea. So can you unpack for us what is the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, if any, and how do we pass these ideas? Like, what's the correct way to think about the response to the accusation of anti-Semitism that has been leveled at these protests, and their response in saying, we're not anti-Semitic, we're just anti-Zionist?
So anti-Zionism has a long history and an interesting evolution. And in the last chapter of my book on Zionism, I deal with it specifically because it warrants that sort of examination. So anti-Zionism began as an internal Jewish position. So in the 20th century, when there was fervent debate in the Jewish world about how to cure the community, the Jewish people, of anti-Semitism, there were two broad views. One was a national movement, which is Zionism, and the other was greater integration and assimilation, which was effectively anti-Zionism, in opposition to a national movement. And so many people who cared deeply for the future of the Jewish people were anti-Zionists. You know, people like Sir Isaac Isaacs here in Australia, people like Edwin Montagu in the United Kingdom. No one would question their commitment to the Jewish people. Even someone like Theodor Herzl, who became the father of modern Zionism, began very much as an assimilationist. He argued for integration. He thought the Jews should, in his words, disappear amongst the crowd. So he was opposed to Zionism in his early days. Mark Twain, who was very fond of the Jewish people and wrote very favorably of them, was opposed to Zionism on the basis, he said, that if you would concentrate so many powerful minds in one place, we'll eventually take over the world. So people opposed Zionism for different reasons and not necessarily out of a hatred for the Jewish people. But
the current claim is that the Zionism of today reflects a settler colonial initiative of Europeans to displace indigenous Palestinians 75 years ago. That's the current claim that you would hear if you attended a pro-Palestinian protest in the streets. So is that anti-Semitic? If so, why?
It can be, or it needn't necessarily be. It depends on the intent of what the person is saying and believing. And it's very difficult to delve into the hearts and minds of people who repeat these slurs and this sort of jargon that's become, ubiquitous and everywhere in the anti-Israel movement. But again, when you break it down, anti-Zionism today is virtually indistinguishable from anti-Semitism. It was once a legitimate path, but two major things changed it and stripped it of any legitimacy it had. The first was the Holocaust, which disproved the notion that assimilation could lead to Jewish survival. And the second was the creation of the State of Israel. So anti-Zionism at that point ceases to become the opposition to an idea and becomes the opposition to an actual state, the existence of a state. Today, it is the opposition to the existence of a state that has existed for 75 years. So you're talking no longer about the opposition to an idea, but the opposition to a people and the inherent rights of a people. The other thing that links anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism is the language that it uses, their beliefs, the slurs which they transmit. So anti-Semitism has historically spoken about Jewish global domination, control of the media, of the banks, of the political class, of anything worth controlling. Anti-Zionists use the same language. Anti-Semitism has spoken about Jewish bloodthirstiness, the killing of children. Anti-Zionism trades in the same thing. Look at the placards and banners at any anti-Israel rally. So whether it's through malice or whether it's through ignorance, these people who now carry the mantle, carry the flag of anti-Zionism, they are supporting anti-Semitism. I think it's an irrefutable truth.
So, I mean, just this morning, our Prime Minister was at the Holocaust Memorial talking about anti-Semitism and how Australia would always be opposed to anti-Semitism. And to me, I thought that was, very interesting and welcome. But if you went to the pro-Palestine rallies on Sunday in the CBD of Melbourne, and you asked any random person on the street, are you opposed to anti-Semitism? 9 out of 10 or 99 out of 100 of them would also claim to be opposed to anti-Semitism. So it seems to be a hollow gesture until and unless we can agree on what is the definition of anti-Semitism. Because it sounds like what you're saying anti-Semitism is very different to the claimed definition of anti-Semitism by the people in the streets and potentially by the Prime Minister too.
I think that's true. But frankly, I don't listen to the claims of the people at these rallies as to what is and isn't anti-Semitism. They're in no position to make that judgment. It is for the Jewish people to determine what hatred against us is, those who have the experience of anti-Semitism, the scholarly knowledge of it, not those who despise our community with a distinct passion. And I think you've arrived at a real problem here, and that is the absolute lack of awareness about what is and isn't anti-Semitism, even among decent people and people of good faith. And partly I think that stems from the fact that we, the Jewish people, are poorly understood. What are we? Are we an ethnic group? Are we a religion? Are we a nation? So there's a lot of confusion around the Jews in very many regards, and particularly around anti-Semitism. But also there's a deliberate attempt to distort anti-Semitism, to obfuscate it, to hide it. It's always been the case. Anti-Semitism has always masqueraded as something else, as religious commentary, as a political movement, as something based on race, and now it's dressed up as a political opposition to Zionism in the State of Israel. But again, you have to strip away those veneers, those masks, and look at the substance of what people are saying, what they're chanting, what they're calling for. Anyone who takes to the streets in opposition to Israel after October the 7th, after the worst atrocity committed against the Jewish people in our time, cannot claim to be a fond admirer of the Jewish people, no matter what they say. I think it's a nonsense.
Thank you. James, thank you for joining us. My first question to you is on the same theme. You might have been observing the ARC Forum in London recently.
I was there.
Oh, you were there. Fantastic. That was the place to be, apparently. So Konstantin Kisin released a short speech, which was widely circulated on the internet. In the speech, he was referring to some of the protesters in London and said, and I quote, "For years now, many of us have been warning that the barbarians are at the gates. We were wrong, they're inside," referring to the protesters in London. Similarly, Douglas Murray was there. And he's been very vocal in relation to this topic, especially to the leaders of the UK. And he's saying that we need to get our own house in order to prosecute people for the glorification of Hamas, which is a proscribed terror organisation, and strip people of citizenship and deport them like Western governments did with ISIS supporters. Do you believe that barbarians are inside the gates of Australia? If so, what should be done about it? What should the Australian government be doing right now? Are we enforcing current laws in relation to the glorification of terror groups?
Thank you, David. Look, again, a real pleasure to be on this panel. Good to see you again, Nimrod. Alex, thank you for your leadership of the community in an incredibly tough time. And David, thanks for this initiative. I've been deeply troubled by what we've seen in our own country after the 7th of October. Obviously, what has happened in Israel is horrific, but for Australians to see that conflict brought here onto our own streets and see people not just protesting in sympathy towards the Palestinian people, which is, of course, a respectable, understandable thing for people to have concern about, but protesting against Israel, and so quickly after the events of the 7th of October, that was so depressing and so challenging, because the first protest we saw was on the Sunday night, the 8th of October. It was in Western Sydney. It was led by an imam, and it included chants that were not just on the lines of from the river to the sea, which we can unpack and we know what that means, but much more explicit than that. He spoke of his joy and his pride at his Palestinian brothers breaking out from Gaza, breaking into Israel. And it was subsequently justified and defended by the Imams Council. And they said he wasn't celebrating the horrific massacre on the 7th of October. What he was celebrating was the people of Gaza finally breaking free from Gaza, breaking free from their cell, the largest open-air prison in the world, that they call it. But as I've said before, that they didn't break out of Gaza to go for a walk. They didn't break out of Gaza to go to the shops. They didn't break out of Gaza to go to a mosque. They broke out of Gaza to hunt Jews in the streets and kill them, rape them, and kidnap them for the crime of being Jewish. So for anybody in Australia to celebrate that, well before Israel had even got ready to respond, let alone commenced its response in Gaza, shows something deeply disturbing about people who are here in our country. And some of them have come here as migrants to our country. Some of them are guests in our country, but others were born here and they were raised here and they were educated here. And that is a very troubling thing for us to have to confront the reality of, and just now start to think about how we deal with it. Because it is not sustainable to have people who think that's an acceptable way to behave and an acceptable thing to celebrate. So what do we do about that? Well, Australia has, since the end of the White Australia policy, a non-discriminatory migration program, both on the basis of race and religion. And no one proposed to change that. No one, myself included, would want to go back to a day where we discriminate against people on the basis of their race or religion when they come to this country. What I think we could do better as a country, and I don't have the exact policy solution for this, but it's a general direction that I think is important that we think about, is screen better for the values of the people who come here. It's not about your religion, it's not about your race, but it is about what you believe. Are you coming here to Australia to sign up to our Australian values? Are you coming here to Australia to be part of our Australian identity? And are your views and is your worldview compatible with that of Australians? Because I don't think it's acceptable, for example, to hold a protest outside a synagogue on Shabbat and close it. I mean, that happened 2 weeks ago in Caulfield in Melbourne, and no one in the Jewish community can ever remember a time that's ever happened before, police evacuating a synagogue on Shabbat because they feared for the safety of the occupants. And that should never happen again. And the people who think that that's an acceptable thing to do and a tolerable thing to do, I think have very real questions to answer.
So do you think that there is the political will currently in Australia to go through those policy initiatives and have think tanks and discussions and forums and community consultation to head in that direction of focusing on belief systems in the context of immigration? Is that something that's at all on the agenda of Australian politics right now?
No, I think it's highly unlikely that you would see, particularly this government right now, open up a conversation on that. And they're highly sensitive to the pro-Palestinian sentiment in some sections of the community, and frankly afraid of those segments of the community and the consequences for them politically if they're seen to get too far away from those groups in the community. They're under real pressure on that left flank. So I don't think they're in a mood to do that. But the other part of your first question was about, are we enforcing the laws that we already have on the books adequately? And the answer is clearly no. When people can shout "gas the Jews" as they did in Sydney Opera House, when they can bring to rallies pictures of Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of the listed terrorist organisation Hezbollah, when they can make incitement, chants of incitement at their rallies, including from the river to the sea, but many other horrific chants of incitement against Jewish people in Israel, and there are no consequences for them, well, then they'll continue to behave with that impunity. And the whole purpose of the years of anti-vilification and anti-incitement laws that we passed at the state and federal level in this country was to prevent things like this from happening and to punish people who are perpetrating it. And I just don't think we've seen sufficient will to enforce those laws and sufficient energy behind enforcing those laws, and really sufficient leadership from the political level to make clear that this kind of behaviour is totally outside the bounds of acceptable conduct, that you can protest, but there are limits to how you can conduct yourself when you protest. I mean, that drive-through of the eastern suburbs of Sydney was deliberately designed to intimidate. It was deliberately designed to incite. And the leaders of that, including one person who is a former convict of terrorism charges, appear to have got away with that scot-free, and there appear to be no consequences. So there is a lack of political will to deal with that problem. And I fear deep down in my bones that all the terrible things we've already seen happen in this country, something much worse could happen and will happen. I think we all fear that will happen. And afterwards, everyone will wake up and say, wow, how did that happen? Where did that come from? Well, I don't think anyone here tonight will be surprised that happens and where it comes from.
So this morning, the ABC reported that the Home Affairs Department has issued more than 800 visas to Gazan residents since the 7th of October. Now, also recently, there was a poll released out of Gaza, which a statistical poll that reviewed what are the actual views of Gazans and Palestinians. 91% of people in Gaza say that their view of the possibility of coexistence with Israeli people has decreased. 72.6% believe that Palestine will emerge victorious in the war. 75% extremely support or somewhat support the military operation of 7 October. 75% want a Palestinian state from the river to the sea. 60% of Gazans view the role of Hamas as very positive or somewhat positive. 97.6% view the United States very negatively, and 95.7% view the UK very negatively. So it does seem that, if you took 800 people at random out of Gaza into Australia, you're almost certain to be importing a certain viewpoint and certain views of the world that are exactly the type of views you've just described as unwanted in Australia. How would a Home Affairs Department under James Paterson, which is a potential possibility or a likelihood, how would you respond to those sorts of issues?
So, David, first of all, about 30 Australians who are citizens have left Gaza and have been supported to come home. And Australian citizens have an absolute right to come home unless they're subject to a temporary exclusion order because of an adverse security assessment by one of our intelligence agencies. So I support the efforts the government has gone through to get those Australian citizens home. The 800 people that you're talking about are not Australian citizens. They do not have the same right to be here. They might be a family member or a relative or a close associate of one of those Australian citizens, and they may want to come here, but we have to think very carefully about whether they should come here and under what circumstances they should come here. The absolute bare minimum for a cohort like that or any migrant seeking a visa is they have to undergo a security assessment. And 800 visas in 6 weeks from a jurisdiction where the Australian government obviously does not have a presence on the ground is a very, very quick turnaround. And it raises questions for me about whether or not the appropriate and adequate security vetting has occurred for that cohort and whether or not all the normal processes were followed, or whether or not some corners were cut in welcoming those people and granting those people visas. So I will be asking questions about this. I am concerned about this at face value. I'm surprised by the size of the number. It's a very large number, given that there are only 30-odd Australian citizens there. To have 800 people being granted visas is worrying at face level.
Do you think it would be a security concern for someone to support the 7th of October Hamas attack? Is that something?
Yes. Yes.
So
yeah, that's.
Making inquiries as to that question is something that's warranted in the circumstances.
The question I have, David, is whether or not you can actually ask that question right now with our immigration system in the way it is and granting of visas. We don't interview people about their political views per se, but I would be very troubled if we have granted a visa to anyone who thinks that October 7 was acceptable in any way. I would be really troubled by that, and I'll be asking lots of questions.
Okay, thank you. Nimrod, another one for you. So one of the sparks of hope that I've seen in my analysis of what's happened in Israel over the last 6 weeks is that on 7th of October, there was a widespread concern that the Israeli Arab population, which is 20% of the population, might have its own uprising against the state of Israel. But it seems over the last 6 weeks that the exact opposite has happened, and that the Arab population of Israel is joining what was formerly the protest movement in Israel, and is actually assisting in both the defense of the country as well as lay activities to help out in all of the civil society aspects. And I think it's encapsulated quite well in the YouTuber or the internet personality Naz Daily, who's an Israeli Arab. He used to describe himself in his own words as Palestinian Israeli, but after the 7th of October, he now describes himself as Israeli Palestinian with the Israeli first. Do you think that gives some sparks of hope as to the landscape between Israelis and Arabs through the region over the next 10, 20, 30 years, if we zoom out?
Well, I'm an optimist at all costs, and I don't think I can afford to be anything but an optimist at all costs. I don't think any Israeli can afford to be anything but optimistic. In fact, our national anthem revolves around the sentence, "We haven't lost our hope," right? So, one of the reasons for that is that if we were pessimistic, then we would have to face the notion that we're not looking at 800 people within our landmass who celebrate Hamas. We're looking at 2 million in Gaza and similar statistics in the West Bank. Not as high, but certainly not low.
It was actually higher according to the poll that I looked at.
The role the Hamas plays in the West Bank is a little different. It doesn't flaunt its terrorist or its militant arm. It flaunts its social impact, local social impact arm, a little bit more community arm in the West Bank. So I think that they relate to it a bit more. Plus, you have to understand how the population is really dispersed in the West Bank to get how this happens. But the fact of the matter is, I didn't know if I would say this during this talk, and I didn't coordinate it with you. Last night, my 5-year-old daughter went to sleep with, my wife put her to sleep, and they were having this talk before she fell asleep, and she said, "Mommy, can I see pictures of Gaza?" And my wife said, "Yes, I can show you tomorrow." And she asked her, "Are there children in Gaza?" And my wife said, "Yes, there are children in Gaza." And my daughter said, "Well, they must be so poor. They must be so poor. I'm so sorry for what they're going through." And my wife said, "Yes, it's difficult for them." My daughter said, "It's difficult for them because we're firing bombs at them, aren't we? And their houses are falling down on them." My wife said, "No, we're not firing bombs at children. We never target children. We're trying to hit the bad guys." It's 5-year-old, so we have to simplify it, right? And then my daughter said, this is the bit that I'm concerned about. She said, "Well, these bad guys, they're parents. They're parents to these children. These children are going to grow up to be Gaza. We have to bomb these children as well." And my wife said, wait a second. We don't bomb the children. We don't have to bomb the children. We don't have to do that. And my daughter, who's clearly terrorized, she just wants to get this terrorizing effect as far away from her as possible, said, no, mom, listen to me. I'm telling you, they're going to grow up to be Gaza, because she said Gaza to her is Hamas, because that's the word that she hears. And the challenge that we have ahead of us is to educate and give hope, right? And where I have hope, I assume that people can change their opinions over time. Two, I believe that what contributes to these fanatic sections of society, and in our case, Gaza, is segregation and the negligent transfer of power to educate these communities to their extreme community leaders. Okay, so if I were accepting people into my country, or if I wanted to prevent the next Gaza offensive, I would be as religious at enforcing our values through education, through working that into their education system after this war, as I am religious at eradicating Hamas. Okay, so we have to believe that. Otherwise, we are facing solutions to this terrible situation which are unrealistic, but most importantly, inhumane. There's no world in which 2 million Gazans leave Gaza and are refugees elsewhere, which takes them away from here. And there's no other solution, despite the fact that, anti-Zionists would love to say that we're genocidal. We're absolutely not. That's not happening either. So they are there. So we have to make a bridge. We have to connect. Now, you asked about Israeli Arabs. The difference between Israeli Arabs and the Gazans is that despite the fact that they're in closed communities, there is enough of a relationship. There is enough of transactionability between the communities to know how much we already have to lose. Okay? So an Israeli Arab woman can do all the things that an Israeli Jewish man can do, obviously, but she can't do all these things in a lot of other Muslim countries. This is a liberal democracy. There are freedoms. Once you've earned your freedoms and you enjoy them, I think it's a more powerful aspect of liberal democracies than what a lot of religions have to sell. Mind you, religions have to sell very, very good values as well. But in terms of like the freedoms that they're experiencing here compared with what they would be experiencing in Gaza, they know what they have to lose, and they have been completely involved. And I think that as a community, they've been exceptional. Obviously, we still have to look out for the extremes, even within Israel, because they could, turn the tide on that.
So, I mean, that argument is basically the view that if we create something of value in Gaza, a beautiful life, something to lose, that they're less likely to be radicalized. I mean, Sam Harris, the famous thinker, says that the Western world has essentially been lying to ourselves to believe that they hate us because of poverty or because of borderlines or because of the absence of something to lose. They hate us because of it's a holy war, that it's a jihadi war, and that they have been radicalized in the spirit of jihad over many, many years. And as a result, there is nothing that can be done to combat that, and that the only solution is to effectively treat this as someone who can't be negotiated with and who needs to be dealt with militarily. What's your view on that?
Right now, there's no negotiation. If it were up to me, no ceasefire, no nothing. We're following through. We're going town by town. We're locating Hamas operatives. We are gaining a huge amount of human. If you know intelligence terms, human means that the Gazans are snitching on them. Forget what they're saying out in the open. They are snitching on them in droves because they don't want to suffer under them anymore. That's what's happening. And that's why we're going to complete this mission unless the rules of the game change. So that's what has to happen right now for many reasons. And just because of the extremity and the savagery of October 7th, it has to be pushed back as far away from us as possible. Afterwards, however, I know this, this rhetoric of the Western world has been lying to itself. I don't know. I think the Western world has a tendency to rest on its laurels and be a little bit lazy in its following through of agendas, right? So we're living a life that we enjoy. We know what we enjoy. We're flaunting it. We accept, refugees, immigrants, etc., believing that they will look at us and say, "Oh, let me copy that." Okay, but we don't fully assimilate them. We certainly don't fully assimilate them into our education system, and we let them live in their own communities. Within their own communities, we tend to be lazy in monitoring who their leaders are. At the very least, if we were to empower moderate leaders who were responsible, if we're not assimilating them into our communities and we're letting them live in their own communities, which is, by the way, the case in Israel. There are many, tight-knit Israeli Arab communities. It's not like they're living everywhere. Tel Aviv is a bit more, complicated. Jerusalem, of course, but they're living within their own communities. At least empower moderate leaders for whom it's important to incorporate the values of liberal democracy and actually let them experience them. Otherwise, what you're having is people who are living in your landmass, in your territory, seeing how much you enjoy life, but they're still on the outskirts. They're still segregated from you, and that sort of like radicalizes. So for me as an Israeli, I cannot afford to adopt there's no negotiation approach in peacetime. I want to make a difference here, right? We know in Israel what it's like to be in war and in peace. In war, we speak Arabic. We're full on Middle East and we're following through right now. But in peacetime, we have to morph. We have to be agile, and we have to invest as much energy in demanding some sort of bridge as we do in demanding the eradication of Hamas. And that's what I tell people who yell, ceasefire now, free Gaza, free Palestine. I tell them, wow, you are the most anti-Palestinian activists I could see. You are spending all of your energies on promoting the Gazan initiative at a time when nobody's going to listen to you, nobody who matters. Because I'm in Israel and I know that you don't matter. We're going to follow through if you're saying this. However, if you spent the exact amount of energies, fighting for Gazans, paying for Gazans, put your money where your mouth is, right? In peacetime, instead of just letting them radicalize and cultivate their hate and their vengefulness until they conduct the next attack, don't be surprised when we respond. We have too much to lose. We've built a really great country here, and we want to protect it. And we don't care what anybody, around the world says about that once we're in defense mode.
Alex, I want to turn to you on the topic of Western civilization. Now, I don't know if you've seen the speech from Barry Weiss, but she gave a great speech where she basically compared the response of the Western world post-September 11 to post-10/7. And in her words, quote, "The difference between 9/11 and 10/7, two massacres of innocent people, symbols to their killers of Western civilization, was the reaction to the horror. The difference between 9/11 and 10/7 was that the catastrophe of 10/7 was followed on October 8 by a different kind of catastrophe, a moral and spiritual catastrophe that was on full display throughout the West before the bodies of those men and women and children had even been identified. People poured into the streets of our capital cities to celebrate the slaughter." She then goes on to explain that it's the result of the progressive movement, the DEI movement, moving through our universities, and a change in the view of the Western civil society and intelligentsia to focus on the oppressed versus oppressor narrative. And that in this context, the oppressor is Israel, the oppressed is the Palestinians, and everything else is justified. There's no amount of barbarism that can't be justified if you're fending off a settler colonial initiative. So that is the predominant view, not just of the protesters, but it's rife through our universities. How do you think the Western civil society needs to get its own house in order in that regard? Not in respect of the people chanting in the streets, but in respect of educational and civil society organizations.
Well, with the second part of that proposition, I think it's absolutely true. So if you spend years spreading this propaganda that Israel's a colonial enterprise, that it's an apartheid state, that it commits ethnic cleansing, genocide, organ harvesting, whatever evil can be thrust upon it, it does. These are the new Nazis, everything like that. Then it follows from that anything inflicted back on it is justified. And some will say that, yes, the October 7 atrocities were perhaps excessive. We don't condone certain elements of those atrocities and crimes, but broadly speaking, as a form of resistance, it's justified. So certainly those who in peacetime perpetuated this mythology, these slurs, this slander about Israel are responsible for what's happening now. There's no question about that.
But do you accept that it's part of a broader transition within the Western academia of a change of a narrative towards oppressed versus oppressor, not just in the Israel-Palestine context, but more generally?
I think that narrative has long been there. And, there are differences in the response to the global response to 9/11, but there are also great similarities. People were cheering in the streets after 9/11 as well. A lot of people thought that America got its comeuppance, that the chickens had come home to roost. 9/11 should have unified the civilized world. Everything should have been clear, but instead it led to this incredible self-doubt. People started to think very quickly, did we inflict this upon ourselves? And why did they think that? Partly human malice and stupidity, which abounds, but also people believe this because they want to believe it. Because if it's our behavior that induces this sort of slaughter and savagery, then it means it's within our means, within our control to change it. Because if it's us, we can change our behavior, they won't hate it as much. It's far more fearsome, it's far more confronting and terrifying to think that there are people among us and people around the world who subscribe to a fundamentally different view of life, of the world, of the people around them. They want to kill where we want to live. They want to destroy where we want to build. And that is a more jarring reality, but I think that's the truth. So certain aspects of the response to 7 of October were unique. And I think that's brought on by a number of factors, partly also the fact that Israel in peacetime, again, was so defamed and slandered that people came to accept this. Partly also the fact that it's remote and people expect things to happen in a war zone far away, whereas to happen in New York City, the greatest city in the world, is a shock to people. But again, I see more similarities. Even the fact that, the conspiracy theories and denial that started coming out very quickly after 9/11. This was an inside job. This was a Mossad hit. This was CIA planned. That level of stupidity. And we're seeing it now as well, people denying it. One of the things that has shocked me, but also, I suppose, informed me, I always wondered how people could question the Holocaust. The Holocaust is the single most documented, evidenced event in human history. Millions of victims, witnesses, hundreds of thousands of perpetrators, immaculate evidence, killing sites, it's all there, and people would still deny it. And now we see why, and we see how. They deny simply because they want to deny. And the same is happening now. People denied September 11. They're denying the rape, the slaughter, everything that happened on October the 7th. So I see difference, but I would disagree with Barry in some aspects as well, because I see a lot of similarities. I think there's a long-term trajectory, a long-term slide in Western civilization, a lack of faith and confidence and seeing what we want to see rather than what's really there.
James, what's your view on the background to the response from Western academia? Do you think that this is something that naturally occurs when there's a decline in a global hegemon like the United States? Is there a change in the tectonic plates of power structures that run our world, and as a result you've got different groups, including academia, heading in different directions, and that there's chaos? Or is there a philosophical underpinning to the abandonment of Israel and of Western ideals in some of our academia?
David, I largely agree with Alex. I think he's right that it's always been there, and we did see it after 9/11 as well, but I think it's getting worse. I think we're on a trajectory and a downward trend, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. And I am disturbed by what is happening in our universities and what we're hearing from some of our academics, particularly American university campuses, which have some of the most extreme academics in the world. And, we saw those tweets from prominent academics at, Ivy League universities in the immediate aftermath of 7 October, where they said things like, what did you think we meant when we talked about decolonisation? Of course, this is what we meant, and violent resistance is a legitimate and appropriate part of the decolonisation agenda. Well, I mean, if that's true, if that is what they mean by decolonisation, then we've got a very serious question to ask ourselves as Western societies: is should we permit this dangerous ideology to be taught to young people that radicalises them and tells them that violence against civilians is an acceptable way to achieve the aims of their political project? I mean, the classic definition of terrorism is that you believe in violence to achieve your political ends. And so I think we do have to think about that really carefully. And one of the things I've been most disturbed by is the prevalence of denialism about what's happened on 7 October. I have parliamentary colleagues on the Labor side who tell me that they have young constituents who they have met in the community, who have come to see them in their office, who genuinely believe, sincerely believe, that 7 October did not happen, or that if it did, it was manufactured by Israel, that there were actors, that this is all fake. And they tell them, I've seen it on TikTok, I've seen the videos, it explains this is all fake, it's not real, it's imagined. Now, I have seen the 43-minute unedited, uncensored vision that's taken from the Hamas cameras. It will stay with me for the rest of my life. It is the most horrific thing I've ever seen. And I'm someone who's able to say to those people, it is real, I know it's real, I've seen it. But many of them just don't want to believe. They actually would much rather believe that Israel created this, that this is a fiction, because it fits their worldview and it reaffirms their worldview of everything they've been taught about Israel. And this comes back to our education system and the ideas that have been propagated through it, and really the libel and the vilification of Israel that's been allowed to happen on our university campuses, not just in the classrooms, but in the classrooms and on campus. That's raised a generation of young people willing to believe the worst when they hear it, and conditioned to believe the worst. And no wonder we see these protests on the streets with no empathy or no understanding of what's happened to the Jewish people.
So what can be done about that? You're a politician. You're potentially going to be part of a government in the next few years. What can be done to set the agenda or change the curriculum of some of Australia's leading universities and or high schools? Is this a problem that, again, is on the agenda at all to solve among your parliamentary colleagues?
Not as much as it should be, but now's the time for us to be thinking about these things. I was there this morning at the opening of the redeveloped Holocaust Museum in Melbourne, and I heard the Prime Minister speak, and I heard Peter Dutton speak, and they were very sincere and very well-meant words about how we must make sure that future generations understand the truth of the Holocaust, and that's what the purpose of that centres like that are. And we need to make sure that they are having great outreach to young people in schools, so that well before they ever set foot on a university campus, they have learnt about the Holocaust, they understand that it is real, and they are determined, like we all should be, that it never be repeated. But I think we do have to look at what is happening in our universities. What is troubling about it is that it's your money, it's our money, it's our taxpayers' money, it's student fees that are going to fund some pretty extreme people propagating some pretty awful ideology, and who excuse it or explain it away with cute terms like anti-Zionism, when we really know that Zionist today in the modern world is used as a way of talking about Jews without saying Jews. No one ever owns up to being anti-Semitic, but they very proudly say they're anti-Zionist, and we know that's what they really mean. I think the adoption of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism is a really important thing that more of our universities should do. Some of them have, many of them have not. We've got a lot of work to do there, because that at least gives us something concrete to work through and work from, and understand what are the bounds of what's acceptable and unacceptable here.
Before we get to Q&A, I just want to raise one topic for you, Senator Paterson, and maybe you, Nimrod, as well. It was mentioned in passing before, but in the past, since 7 October, there have been more than 80 attacks on American bases in Syria and Iraq. Yesterday, US troops at Al-Assad Air Base in Western Iraq reportedly came under drone attack, and there was a limited response from the US targeting a vehicle linked to Iranian proxies near Baghdad. Are you concerned that this is now growing into a regional war? And, what is the risk that this expands into direct action with Iran and or Russia? Are Russia and China involved in this situation somewhere behind the scenes? What's your macro view on this very specific battle and its impact on the regional and global players? That's to you, Senator.
I'll have a quick go first, and then Nimrod, be interested in your views. There is absolutely an increasing alignment between authoritarian states, including Iran, Russia, China, and North Korea. We've seen that in the war in Ukraine, where China is the principal financial sponsor of Russia's war. North Korea has become one of the main arms suppliers, and Iran is another one of them. And we are seeing it in this conflict too, in that Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, other Iranian proxies in the region are being activated by the IRGC to wage war on Israel and the United States and other allies in the region. Now, at this point, it doesn't look like it has crossed that threshold into much more overt and open conflict. But frankly, I think the Iranians have got away with far more than they should have at this point, when they are effectively waging war on American military personnel. And so far, as far as we can see, not bearing any consequences for that. There's been no overt or obvious retaliation on the IRGC directly, and I'm very troubled by that. The objective that the United States very clearly has is to keep Hezbollah out of this conflict. And so far, largely, that appears to be successful. And that is a very welcome thing, because that would be catastrophic for everyone. I have no doubt in my mind that Israel would prevail and would do so with the support of the United States and others, but it would come at a very high cost to many civilian lives and others, and that's not what we want to see. So that's clearly what is guiding the Americans' restraint in their response to the Iranians, and the Iranians are being clever in the way in which they're using proxies in an arm's length way, but quite sophisticated weapons have been deployed here. Cruise missiles have been fired towards Israel. Drones are being used against American bases. I mean, this is not amateur hour stuff. This is highly sophisticated, and it can't happen without the IRGC financing, coordinating, and supporting it.
Nimrod?
Yeah. Well, I think about this a lot when I have, my energies to do so, because if this evolves into an all-out war, we're smack in the center of it, and I can't really comprehend what that will mean for my family and for my friends and loved ones and for me. But it is an option. I saw a short video about how quickly the world devolved into the Great War, into World War I. Just in it, like this chain of events, where the first event you would never tie to a 5-year, tens of millions of people, of fatalities war. So it can certainly go there. But there's it's saying in Hebrew as well as it is in English. It's darkest before the dawn. That's an optimistic approach. I was 13 when Israel signed its peace agreement with Jordan, which is a relatively strong peace agreement that we have. Even though they suspended relations with us, that is a sort of way for a Hashemite kingdom with a majority Palestinian population to, go on a break with Israel before going back to a strong peace agreement. We signed the peace agreement with Jordan. We could have used the momentum of the Jordanian peace agreement to sign stronger peace agreements with the Palestinians on or around 1995 and 96. That was the atmosphere in Israel. In fact, there were people driving in Israel with stickers on their cars saying, at least let's keep the Golan Heights, because they were feeling like we're going to make peace with the Palestinians, and then we're going to make peace with the Syrians and give up the one strip of land in Israel that we are really scared of giving up, because it gives the Syrians territorial control over us. And at the time, the Syrians were a functional nation, far more than they are today. So people were thinking about that. They were like, okay, we're going to follow through with the Palestinians. This was happening, as crazy as Arafat was. And then buses started blowing up. Now, October 7 had 1,400 people die on one day, and we're sort of having the trickle down of the stories, and we saw the videos, Facebook Live, etc. But when public transport in the middle of your metropolis blow up with children inside and kill 20, 30, 40 people at a time and blow them to smithereens, and it's this random, and it's the first time you're really, really facing like a high frequency suicide bombings. Like, oh my God, so many people are willing to take their lives and blow themselves up just to kill me. And your mother doesn't let you go out with your friends because she's afraid you'll blow up on the bus, yada, yada. That was traumatizing. And most of those terror attacks were by a young organization that was essentially formed to terrorize the Israelis away from a full peace with the Palestinians, and that organization was Hamas. And it in many ways succeeded, even though the Oslo Accords were signed when everybody was just out of energies to follow through on them properly, right? It's like they were signed, but then Netanyahu gets elected because the public ear just couldn't stand the pain anymore. And we had a good leader in Rabin who would frequently say that the people who died in the buses were victims of peace, which is a crazy statement that worked circa 1995 until he was shot. Didn't work for everyone, but we didn't have the energies to follow through on the Oslo Accords. Guess what? We were at the precipice of a very significant peace accord with Saudi Arabia, of a normalization and essentially a peace agreement with Saudi Arabia. It would have enabled us to begin trading on this landmass. It would have connected Australia, India, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Europe, right? We're already having, I think we have direct flights to Australia thanks to some of these arrangements, if I'm not mistaken, but they would be shorter if I believe if we have those agreements in place. So we were at the precipice of that. And ironically, the IRGC uses its most useful idiot, the Shiite Iranians, is sort of like allow the Sunni Hamas leaders who, and they don't care about the actual Gazans themselves, but they allow them to basically pull the same trick again 30 years later, to dissuade the Muslim nations around the world from signing any agreement with genocidal Israel, and to dissuade the Israeli public from signing an agreement with any Muslim who demands anything, because the Saudi Arabians are making demands that would scare off a terrified Jew. They want the access to nuclear power so that they can protect themselves from Iran. So does Hamas succeed in doing this? I don't know. But this war there's a lot more at stake in this war than just repopulating the outskirts of Gaza, the towns on the outskirts of Gaza. Because there is so much at stake, yes, I believe that there is a probability that it devolves into a regional conflict. Having said that, or even an all-out war. Having said that, and this is important for me to say proudly, okay? There are a lot of advantages to democracies, even when things don't always work, even when not all of our leaders are leaders that we, fully respect or that we voted for. The advantages are that even if there is corruption in some democracies, it's not institutionalized corruption. Decisions are made within government's tenures, and there's changes of guard, relatively frequent changes of guard, so corruption doesn't settle. And when that happens, our militaries are far stronger than the opposition. Totalitarian regimes will flaunt a strong military, will show you that they have drones and that they have missiles and that they have these capabilities, but they are rotten on the inside. And you can see this very clearly on the border of Ukraine and Russia. Because in our minds, don't tell me that any one of us didn't think that Russia would just plow through the Ukraine before we were ready to defend it. At the end of the day, with Western support, but no Western soldiers fighting there except for the Ukrainian soldiers, the Ukrainians are relatively holding their ground, comparatively speaking. And they are exposing what corrupt systems put in the battlefield. And we're in a sense doing that as well. I want to finish on another optimistic note. Last week, on one of the days, we can't say when, we had a successful in-army usage of the Iron Beam. This was published in the news in Israel. I don't know if you've heard of the Iron Beam. I assume Senator Paterson has. The Iron Beam makes the Iron Dome look like sticks and stones. It is a laser-based protective system that costs zero. So the Hamas and the Hezbollah are very proud at firing rockets at us, because every $400 rocket that they fire at us, which, by the way, its operatives immediately die afterwards. It's the last thing that they do in their life is to throw this rocket at us, hoping to randomly kill some civilians. They fire it, and then they say, yes, but we caused the Jews to spend $40,000 on an interceptor, or $700,000 if it's one of our bigger ones, or even $2 million if it's the Arrow. Well, this beam costs nothing, and it protects tanks, and it protects from mortar shells, etc. So the nice thing about Israel is that it's relatively always a technological advancement away from changing the entire battlefield, which is what I'm hopeful will happen. So I hope we have enough time to do that and test out these defensive systems, that we do what we need to do in Gaza, and that the IRGC proves that it is not courageous enough to face us head on. It will use its proxies, and none of the proxies in and of themselves, none of them independently serve as a threat.
Let me ask you one final question before we turn to Q&A. Under the prime ministership of Naftali Bennett, he had a protocol called the Octopus Doctrine, where he essentially said that up until the time that he was prime minister, the status quo in Israel was to respond to the tentacles of Iran, being Hamas and Hezbollah. So if there was any action brought against Israel by Hamas or Hezbollah, they would respond directly to Hamas or Hezbollah, but Iran would remain immune. Under the Bennett Octopus Doctrine, there were a lot of mysterious assassinations and fires and explosions inside Iran, because he wanted to not attack the tentacles of the octopus, but strike at the head. And do you think that there is the possibility here for Israel to try to end the conflict by striking at the head of the octopus?
I doubt we're going to get like a condensed Hollywood version of this drama. As much as I'd like it to be over really soon and get back to pre-October 7 life, which is also just it's a dream that won't come true. Nothing's going to be the same after October 7th. But no, this is going to be longer. This is going to play out longer, even if inside the Israeli government, people agree that attacking the head is more effective than fighting the proxies. Right now, nationally speaking, mate, they came out of Gaza, and what they did to our people is just we're only there. We're mentally only there. We go to sleep with it. We cry every 2 hours. We need to take care of Hamas. This is a personal thing right now. Now, whether or not Israel then does the strategic thing and faces Iran head on, there are various ways to do that. We had the Munich massacre happen to us. We can also play the long game, is what I'm trying to say. You might not see it like on time, like it was a well directed movie, but we also play a long game.
All right, moving to Q&A now. Alex, this one's for you. Can you discuss the effect of the effective dehumanization of the Jewish Israeli people, as seen by the lack of the public street recognition of the depth of depravity shown during the 7th within the general community, and especially the women's community? Me too, unless you're a Jew. And how can we change that? Or is this not a real thing, and I've been seeing shadows, or is it a preparation for a future event?
No, it's very much a real thing. And we've seen the response of the so-called human rights organizations and the great defenders of human rights that are the Australian Greens, the trade union movement, a lot of the hard left generally, and a lot of the public. There's been, some apathy, some victim blaming, denial, all of these responses. And why they're occurring, I think it's for the reasons we discussed earlier. When over years and years and years, and this goes back a long time, you mentioned my first book, The Anti-Israel Agenda, where I kind of chart the history of the demonization, the politicization of the war on Israel. You look at things like, 10th of November, 1975, the UN declares Zionism to be racism. So if Zionism is racism, we are all racists. and we deserve everything we get. That's how it goes. If we're committing genocide and ethnic cleansing, we have no right to be there. And yes, there may be excesses, but ultimately resistance is justified, as they chant at their rallies every week. And these things are an inevitability and to be defended. So this is the consequence of a long-term debasement of the Jewish people and the state of Israel. It stems partly from anti-Semitism. It stems partly from a hatred of Israel, which, as we've discussed, is often one and the same. In terms of changing it long-term, I mean, we've seen so much ugliness emerge, but also, as I said, it's made things a lot clearer. It's exposed the hypocrisy, the dishonesty of a lot of segments of our society. I think that a lot of people who maybe viewed the Greens as a legitimate political actor will no longer do so. I think it's exposed a lot of the issues on university campuses, the power of social media to poison young minds, and of platforms, particularly like TikTok. There's now talks about banning it in the United States, which I think would be welcome in the circumstances. So, you know, it's made things very clear, but it's also shown us the amount of work we have to do on multiple fronts. And I think, as James spoke about earlier, you know, we're concerned by the universities, but it begins much earlier than that. You know, a lot of young people already come to university with a certain ideology, which is then just affirmed in that environment. So it's got to begin in the schoolyard. It's got to begin with greater engagement with Jewish kids to understand who we are as a people, that we are human. And then maybe over generations we'll see a change, but it's a huge battle.
Senator Paterson, first, thank you and all the panelists. I have seen a dangerous narrative shift in the discourse from a two-state solution towards a one-state solution. This is coming from Palestinian supporters openly being supported by the Greens and the progressive left. We saw this openly put forward as the solution by Francesca Albanese and the other person on Q&A. Is this something being discussed at government level? And does the government have a plan to address this dangerous change in narrative before it gains support in the wider secular Australia?
This is a really good question, and I am really disturbed by the growing popularity of this idea and talking about it as if it's a plan for peace and a plan for harmony, and we're going to have this wonderful liberal multicultural democracy on the land of Israel with Palestinians and Jews living aside each other like some kind of cartoon. Let's all be really clear about what this would actually mean. It would mean the end of the state of Israel. It would mean wiping out Jews on the land of Israel, which is what the advocates of this idea really want. When they say from the river to the sea, they mean it, and they mean that that would be a place that would be completely unsafe for Jews, and they hope the Jews would leave, and the ones that didn't would face a very serious fate. So Francesca Albanese is an extremist, but she has the imprimatur and the brand of the United Nations, which for people who are outside of our circles, who don't understand the history of bias at the United Nations against Israel, think of it as a completely legitimate position and someone speaking with authority. So it is a dangerous idea that we have to tackle head on. And it has no support at the political level in Australia other than, I think, some Greens. I think certainly some Greens would advocate it, but no one in any mainstream political party entertains it. But you're right to flag it because it will gain some popularity in the public consciousness for people who don't understand it and think at a conceptual level, well, what could be wrong with everybody living together and alongside each other? I mean, we know you cannot live alongside Hamas, which is exactly what this would ask the people of Israel to do.
Thank you. Nimrod, before 7th of October, certain groups were recording strange activities on the other side of the fence in Gaza. Why were these recordings not taken seriously? Furthermore, there were warnings by Gazan Hamasniks that were also ignored. Why were these warnings ignored? Again, it took many hours for rescue services to attend. What could the reason for this be? I think there's an implication in the question that either there was a reason for all of this being ignored, or there was something untoward going on.
Yeah, it could be an implication. I read the way the question was asked by Talia. I'm not entirely sure. It could just be just a genuine attempt at understanding how such a horrible thing
Why
happens.
don't you answer both ways the question?
Yeah. So this question is asked in various ways. Sometimes it directly alludes to some conspiracy. Most most prominently some sort of like potentially a false flag operation, where either Israel attacked itself, or Israel purposely ignored the signs and signals and allowed both the Hamas to penetrate Israel and allowed the Hamas to operate within Israel for the first 8 hours to sort of like exacerbate the damage that they were causing and the trauma that the nation would be caused, so that Israel could wage some sort of war and escalate the situation in the country, maybe for the prime minister to get away from his from his indictments at the moment. But when these questions are asked this way, I like to say two things, and Senator Paterson has already heard me say this. The people asking these questions have three proverbial pills in their hand that they can take. Okay, one of them is everything is a conspiracy theory. The United States took down the Twin Towers. Nothing you see on the news, absolutely nothing is real. Don't even turn the TV on. And then what I advise these people who believe these things, in order for them to be happy, is to just, drink more alcohol, go swimming or something. There's no, that just means you have absolutely no influence on your reality. Okay. The other alternative is that this world is so crazy that we live in some sort of like simulated reality. Not even factions within our world control what's going on. This has some sort of like higher entity that's just making things happen. There's no semblance of choice. And again, I say, go drink, go get wasted, just to do whatever makes you happy and isn't necessarily lucid. But if you're courageous enough, face reality. Reality is complex, really complex. Learn it. See how these things happen. Really, really break it down. And I'm happy to break down October 7th for you. Israel was in 10 months of political unrest. All of our institutions were focused on the protests and were focused on a judicial reform, which is actually a crowning moment for a democracy when it amends its constitution one way or another. We could have come out of the judicial reform with a constitution, which would have been essentially a really good result for the democracy, and some amendments to the judicial system that may have been required to a certain extent, despite the veracity of the protests. We were, as a nation, focused on that. We had a relatively long period without an offensive in Gaza that included an incursion. The last one was in 2014. If you look at Israel, 6 years after the Six-Day War, we were surprised in Yom Kippur also in a manner that presented an existential threat to Israel due to an intelligence mistake on our most holy day, on Yom Kippur. So when institutions sort of like invest their energies in certain areas, either inside Israel, suddenly the West Bank became a more important focal point for Israel than Gaza. And when you believe that you have a relationship with Gaza that is transactional, okay, there's money being wired, there is some form of transactional relationship, there are employees coming in to Israel over a long period of time, then that's the point in time where you start seeing drills like training sessions of Gazan of Hamas terrorists on the border, and you analyze them as training sessions. You don't analyze them as preparation for war. Additionally, and this is, by the way, what happened in the Yom Kippur War. The Syrian and Egyptian armies were talking about a mutual training exercise a lot. And we ignored other indications that it was preparation for a war. Now, regardless of how you read it, there are people in the intelligence corps that are supposed to be devil's advocates to the head of the intelligence corps and always bring a different scenario. Regardless of how you read it, if you were to read the Hamas's activities around the fence in the preceding week or two, to the event, you would have to make a decision which is borderline outside of the authority of the IDF, borderline, to change your the amount of troops that you have, the amount of ready and ammunition-filled planes, helicopters, and drones that you have on the border, on a Saturday, on a holiday. You have to make that decision. You have to say, from now on, every Saturday, until we change our assessment, the army is going to be at full capacity. That costs a lot of money. You really, as a state that has to disperse its resources, you have to make a decision that has
Nimrod,
actual
isn't
cost
there
to that.
also another theory that as a result of Netanyahu's coalition partners, there was a bigger deployment in the West Bank with 32 battalions in the West Bank and only 2 battalions guarding the fence as a result of the coalition partners sort of having that better focus or bigger focus in the West Bank and taking the eye off the ball in Gaza?
There was, comparatively speaking, there were many more battalions in the West Bank. There was actual activity and noise in the West Bank. However, if there were 16 battalions in the West Bank, I am not sure that there would have been much more than 2 in Gaza on a Saturday morning on Simchat Torah. So I want to also deflect that theory as well. I don't think there would have been more than 2 in Gaza at the time. Moreover, just how an army works, hey man, I'm the best soldier in this unit. It's a Saturday morning. I've been here for a long time. I'm the most experienced one. You're a young gun. You just came in. You take this Saturday on Simchat Torah. I don't need to do it. So you got even within the soldiers who are just a little less equipped, a little younger, are there. Now let's go to Hamas. Back in those 90s, when they conducted those suicide bombings against us, how were they so effective in infiltrating Israel every time? Hamas's DNA is actually quite astounding. It is the DNA that enables it to conduct an offensive like this when it wants to, and it is the DNA that will cause it to lose itself because we decided to eradicate it. It's the same thing. It's 2 sides of the same coin. Hamas's operatives have absolutely no freedom to improvise, and they know almost nothing about the other cells within the organization. You've got 3 to 5 person cells. They're getting instructions from one commander, and only that commander gives instructions to 3 to 5 cells, and that's the way that they work. And nobody knows anything about anything else. So as far as they don't know what they're going to do until the very last second, because their lives are so unimportant to Hamas that Hamas says, "Oh, we're sending you on the suicide bombing right now. Guess what? Go to the mosque, say your prayers, and go to suicide bombing. What we've been training for." So when an intelligence doesn't focus itself, and it may hear one cell planning an infiltration, or pick up on one cell maybe planning an infiltration, or see one cell training, you don't anticipate, if you have the wrong conception, you don't anticipate all of them doing it at once. And when all of them do it at once, then your whatever response you do have ready for the first 7 hours is going to seem like you didn't respond. Guess what? We had planes in the air in the first 7 hours. They took out, I would say, about 200 operatives. But then try to think deeply. And again, this is a long response. And think about how problematic it is. To convey the true answer is taking me about 5 minutes. But this is a generation with a low attention span that gets its news on TikTok and simply cannot comprehend that someone could go into a house and pull a baby out of a pregnant mother's stomach and cut it open and then cut the baby. I can't comprehend it. There's got to be something different. Somebody really evil has got to be out there pulling a false flag operation or something like that. No. Okay.
We're running up on time, but I'm going to go until 9:40 for everyone who's listening. Hope that's okay with everyone. Couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up at 9:40. Senator Paterson, considering all the anti-Semitism we've experienced in Australia recently, for example, the attack on the cyclist, the hit and run attempt at the elderly gentleman that was attacked with a syringe, as well as the violent rallies, we feel unsafe in Australia. We feel that the police, especially in Victoria, do not have enough power to protect us, and instead we're being asked to stay home, have our kids take exams at home instead of going to uni, send our kids to school without school uniforms, etc. We're scared. What can Australia do to help us feel safer in our own homes?
Let me separate my answer into two different parts. On the one hand, of course, we should all follow the advice of Victoria Police and CSG, and they are saying at the moment you do need to be careful. Unfortunately, even in Melbourne, even in Australia, visibly identifying yourself as a Jew, and that's a terrible thing. But in the medium and the long term, this can be never acceptable in a country like Australia. We can never tolerate the idea that the solution to the problem is to hide your Jewishness and hide who you are, and that's the way to be safe. So while we follow the security advice in the short term, we have to be determined to build a society where that's not necessary in the medium and the long term. And it starts by making sure there are consequences for the people who are perpetuating these crimes. I mean, that video of those deranged people running out of a pub on Chapel Street in South Yarra to attack an elderly man who had an Israeli flag on his bicycle was deranged. It was unhinged. It was bizarre that anyone thought that was appropriate, but I'm not aware of any consequences for those people who did that. And of course, there's been much worse incidents than that. You referred to the gentleman with the syringe, obviously the protests outside Central Shul in Caulfield on Shabbat a few weeks ago. These are disturbing things. And frankly, the stickering that we've seen, supposedly anti-Israel stickering, but also only put on Jewish businesses, including in Balaclava, as recently as this week. I mean, we know what this is about. It's about striking fear in the heart of the Jewish community, and the only way is to arrest and punish the perpetrators. Now, do police have the powers to do that? Yes, I believe they do. Frankly, I think it's an excuse to say they don't have the powers. Probably the only extra legislative power that they need here in Victoria is to restore the move on powers that they used to have, which this government has repealed. That would have been useful for the police in relation to the protest outside the synagogue. They could have directed the protest to move on, and if they didn't move on, they could have arrested the individuals who refused to do so. That is something that should be fixed and fixed promptly. But other than that, actually, it's just a will to enforce the law. And police, in my view, have been far too timid in doing that with these demonstrators. They haven't adequately explained why they've been so timid, but there has been a philosophy more generally that police believe that they have to softly and more gently enforce the law around these kind of events, because if they rigorously enforce the law, that might promote a backlash. And I think that's a very troubling position for police to have got themselves in. They're fearful and afraid of enforcing the law, and we have to fix it.
Final question to you, Nimrod, something that was touched on by you in the context of your daughter. We're all obviously seeing lots of shocking images of the humanitarian situation in Gaza. There are 2 million people in Gaza. Not all of them are Hamasniks. Obviously, we all feel for the innocent civilians in Gaza. Do you think enough is being done to talk about the potential future for the citizens of Gaza, for the civilians in Gaza, and to sort of think about how that future could be a brighter future, and what could happen for them to actually build them a way out of this in a positive direction?
Well, it starts with how we're conducting this war. I'm very much involved in one of the divisions of the army, I think we spoke about it earlier, that has a direct effect on loss of life in Gaza. I own that. It's a part of the Air Force, it's the UAV division. The amount of effort that the IDF is putting into removing civilians from populated areas and minimizing civilian casualties, as difficult as it is to hear when you're not getting reports of how many Hamas operatives and terrorists died, but you are getting constant reports from Hamas about how many civilians and children died. I can tell you that the efforts being put into this are, you could probably not be able to explain them to a mother of a soldier, because the efforts don't include waiting on a target and thinking about it. They include putting many soldiers in harm's way. They include taking on the rockets being fired in from Gaza, from areas that we're not going to attack. They include waiting with the ground incursion until, the population walks away. They include not attacking real population centers like the schools that they're in now, even though the Hamasniks are in the schools. All of this is slowly, very slowly, that's trickling into the minds of the Gazans. If you actually invest your time and go into Gazan social media, I'm relatively connected to that through a certain account. You'll see that when they do get a chance, when they are walking south, finally, they'll hurl a few curse words at the Hamas government on the way down. They'll say that this is all their fault, and that the Jews have been nice to us, is what they say. The Zionists have been nice to us, or the occupier has been nice to us. Is there enough thought about what's going to happen next? I would say certainly it's not in the discourse across all of society, because we're still focused on what we need to do, and there's still a long way to go, about 2 or 3 months. But I've actually never really heard Netanyahu. I've always heard Netanyahu speak in terms of victory, but in his last 2 press conferences, he has spoken in terms of victory and then ensuring that this will happen, that this will never happen again, by making sure that the Gazans will never want to make it happen again, that they can build a life there. This is the rhetoric that he's built. Now, cynics will say that Netanyahu likes to paint a picture of a distant future because you will conclude that he's the one who's going to lead us there, and that's how he stays in power. However, I do welcome the change in rhetoric, that he's thinking long term about what to do after in Gaza. He said that in the last 2 press conferences, and yeah, sure. I mean, within our homes, we think about that. What's going to happen next? I mean, if my 5-year-old daughter's more limited logic leads her to believe that they're simply going to be terrorists and kill us all, which actually reflects what's happened up until now, then we should probably do something different. So we speak about that, and I certainly tend to invest more of my time in the public sector to sort of think about Israel's future and preventing this from happening by doing things a little bit differently than we did in the past.
On that note, we'll wrap it up. I just want to say a huge thank you to each of James, Alex, and Nimrod. Thank you to everyone logging on from home for your attention, and we hope that this was some informative for you and inspiring in some way, and that you got something out of it, and really appreciate your time. Have a good night to everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.